Wait, Karl, go ahead, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Miguel. Well, again, my name is Wade Lance with Illusive Networks, and we appreciate our partners, Adaptive Security, and the opportunity to speak with you all today. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is kind of some real changes that have happened this year in cybersecurity that we are seeing really play out across all sectors, particularly the financial sectors, that have really exacerbated some existing issues and making a challenging cybersecurity environment even more challenging than it has been. I think most cybersecurity professionals are familiar with this visual, the idea that defenders have to be right every time and attackers only have to be right once. And this has gotten dramatically worse now in what we're calling the new no normal, right? The lack of consistency in user behavior and connectivity and application usage based on changes in the market around COVID-19. And so what we'd like to do is turn it over to our partner and influencer, Karl Mattson, to walk us through exactly where some of these issues are cropping up. So Karl, take it away.
Thank you. Karl Mattson. I'm a board advisor for Illusive, but also I was one of Illusive's early customers several years ago in their deceptions package. And what I'd like to cover today is sort of a macro look at how the COVID era is affecting cybersecurity, in particular insider threats. So in particular, what we want to look at with insider threats is that the Ponemon Institute 2020 insider threat study attributes 62% of insider threats to simple negligence. There's only a small subset of insider threats, about 23% that they measured, that are actually like deliberate incidents. So when we look at insider risk overall, we have to consider both the intentional harm that an insider causes, but also the harm that's caused simply by the employee not paying close attention and making mistakes and errors. So the fundamental theme that we find now in the COVID era is this idea of the probability of attempts is rising because of the stressors involved. If there's one sort of theme that I'd like to take away is that the stress is felt everywhere. It's felt in financial pressure. It's felt in the pace of change. It's the motivations and the likelihood that attempts will occur, whether they're intentional or whether they're unintentional, has gone through the roof. So the opportunity, of course, for those malicious insiders that do intend to do harm does increase when an employee does not perceive that they're being looked over the shoulder because they're working from home. And there's a rapid pace of change, and an insider can perceive the real or unreal ability to get away with taking data or moving money without anybody being caught, because they're oftentimes working from home and they don't have the person next door to them or their manager right there that would motivate them perhaps to not try that event. So the number of attempts, the raw number of attempts is rapidly increasing. So meanwhile, while the number of attempts, intentional and intentional, are increasing, the probability of detecting them by the defenders is decreasing for multiple reasons. We're not operating as business as usual. There is no normal baseline. So for example, behavioral-based models or behavioral-based detections, SIM rules. When it used to be the case that a SIM rule would trigger when an activity happened at 3 a.m. in the morning, that baseline is no longer valid because employees typically in a work from home setting are working at sort of an irregular pattern. So the investments that we've made in anomaly detection based on user behavior or based on patterns, many of those detection patterns no longer apply. As well, we're also seeing, of course, the actual increase in attempts whether it's phishing attempts, hacking attempts on our networks. So our SOC teams are getting fatigued. There's so much alert volume right now in an incident responders queue that it's even less likely now that an incident response team is going to identify a particular set of alerts as associated with a sophisticated insider, especially. So what that leaves us with then is now what we call the COVID gap, and that's the next slide. And this gap is the combination of increased probability and the decreased probability of catching. So this is exactly what we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis. There was 73% increase in the insider attack in the last economic crisis. Even just before the COVID era began, the Ponemon Institute, the 2020 insider threat study showed a 47% increase in insider threats and insider incidents just before this crisis happened. Now you add the additional stressors of rather large scale unemployment that we've never seen, the disruptions that are taking place in organization, the working remotely, the stressors that cause insider risks are spiking. And now we're seeing, of course, then the 300% increase in attacks. False positives are increasing because now an employee working remotely and working strange hours of the day or logging in from locations which have never been seen before, those are creating false alarms that make it less and less likely that we're going to use a legacy technology stack to identify the insider risk. And the key thing, of course, with insider is that so often that insider is operating with some degree of legitimate credentials. And so an insider risk is inherently more difficult to detect because there are fewer and fewer alerts going off on a legitimate user's activity than, for example, somebody who's using a sort of a brute force type of attack on the network. So what that leaves us with as a security team is an enormous challenge to confront when it comes to insider risk now here in the COVID era. And I'd like to turn it over to Wade, and Wade will talk through some case studies on specifically how this is unfolding.
Yeah, thanks, Karl. Appreciate that. So yeah, what we want to talk through is kind of a couple of examples of the traditional or normal, if you will, insider threat behaviors, and then how Illusive gives the security team a distinct advantage for any attack, but in particular where an insider is a part of the process. So let's walk through a couple of scenarios, and we'll see how it plays out. So in this scenario, the driver that we see in the gap is related to this user Steve. He's an employee. He's a loan processor. Now he's working from home, so his job is very different. There have been some layoffs perhaps in the organization, so he feels a little threatened. Maybe he has some personal debt, recently bought a house, who knows. Tends to be doing more work now, carrying more load. And in this case, our guy Steve actually has a colleague who is a competitor asking him about loan applications. And so we can see the stress and the opportunities and some of the frustration that an employee might be facing in a season like this. At the same time, the incident response team is struggling also. Many of them are also having to work from home. It's harder for them to collaborate. They're used to being in office, having a war room during an incident. Sometimes they don't have access to the kind of tools that they did, being in the SOC perhaps and seeing lots of displays concurrently. Then we stack on top of that this very high level of alerts. Lots of alerts that have to be researched because user behavior is so different now. I like what Karl was saying about that alert at 3 o'clock in the morning. I know a lot of people who wake up at random times, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, wake up and they remembered something they need to do. And so VPN into the environment and take 30 minutes and get some work done. And this creates issues in the modern security environment. And let's see how that plays out. So without Illusive and kind of in the normal behavior of an insider, we can see that our guy Steve is going to be lured into violating policy and trying to get at some sensitive information. So the first thing that Steve notices is that there is a privileged credential cached on his system from an administrator who connected to it recently, and that credential was not cleaned up correctly. And we see this happen very frequently from privileged users like help desk or systems administrators. And so a lot of tools would allow Steve to identify this credential either in memory or in a separate user profile, everything from Mimikatz to Windows Credential Editor, right? There's a Windows tool that would just show you this kind of information. So Steve identifies that there is a privileged credential available on his system. And in many cases, what people do is satisfy their curiosity, right? They're not intending to be malicious per se. They're just curious to go looking to see in some information, and now they've got a privileged opportunity to do that. And so Steve identifies that on his system, he has access to a couple of network drives. And of course, all this information is real. This information is available to him, but now he can connect as a privileged user because of the credential he has access to. And so Steve is going to go look into this Northeast Mortgage Filings directory. And in that directory, he identifies a file that looks interesting, the approved applications, which he then opens on his system and begins to examine that information, and may in fact be tempted to take that information home with him. He may already be at home, but may pull it off onto another system. And so this is where we see how, Steve has violated policy, security policy, many times in this process. But because he's a legitimate user on a legitimate system, and the difficulty in seeing through this kind of anomalous behavior, many times this goes undetected and for long periods of time. This may happen over and over and over again in an environment, giving the insider an opportunity to accumulate a large amount of information that then can be used in an inappropriate manner. So let's look at how the Illusive platform works to give the security team, Ed in this case, a big advantage over the insider, Steve. And so we'll run through the exact same scenario, but we'll see how Illusive interrupts the process and changes the storyline. So as the user, Steve, is looking for a privileged credential on his system, looking into the memory or the cache, what has happened is Illusive has examined this endpoint as part of our process, and we have also identified this privileged credential. Now, it could be in a browser history, it could be in the memory, it could be in a user's profile, but wherever it may be, we have identified a privileged credential. And so we have a platform capability called Attack Surface Manager. And Illusive Attack Surface Manager identifies these kinds of conditions where there is an opportunity to get access to a privileged credential, and simply removes that privileged credential and replaces it in many cases with a deceptive user. This is incredibly powerful because what's happening is that opportunity to move is no longer available. The only opportunity to move is through the use of a deceptive credential, which appears to be privileged. And so we are, at Illusive, we are not running an agent on the endpoint. We are a completely agentless solution. So if Steve just saw this and went along his way, he'd be okay. But in this case, what Steve does is, uses that credential in an attempt to move to another system. And Illusive immediately detects that behavior because of the deceptive credential that was used, and begins a silent forensics investigation on Steve's PC as this is happening. So right away, the scenario has changed. Steve has been detected on the first movement attempt that he makes because of the nature of the deceptive credential that we've planted on this system. Now, in many cases, the security team could intervene at this point and stop this behavior. But let's see what happens if the security team allows this to play out through the rest of the process. So the next thing that Steve attempts to do is to identify where can he go with his new credential. And in this case, remember that normally Steve had access to a couple of directories, but now Illusive has in fact planted a deceptive share that's hidden on this system. And so the Northwest Mortgage high net worth filings is a much more interesting directory than the others. This appears to be a great opportunity to get at some really juicy information. And one of the powerful things about what Illusive is doing is that without Illusive, all of the data that Steve sees is real. The credentials that he sees, the directory that he sees, the file, it's all real and it's all actionable. But with Illusive, much of the information that Steve is faced with is deception, and he has to pick correctly every single time not to be detected. So in this case, Steve is lured into examining this high network share directory. And of course, Illusive is still gathering forensics information that Steve is unaware of as this is happening. Steve now in the directory decides to look at what files are available to him. And we've done the same thing where before Illusive, everything that Steve would see is real, but after Illusive, much of the information in the directory is hidden but deceptive information. And once again, Steve makes a bad choice and looks at a commercial lending contracts document being lured into interacting with deceptive data. When he pulls that file onto his system, it turns out that file is beaconized. So when the file is opened on Steve's system, maybe he transfers it to another system, but when that system is opened, it calls back to Illusive and says, hey, I am being viewed or edited on this particular system as it is happening. So this is a very, very powerful capability that really interacts with the user in every phase of the process, making it extremely difficult for any attacker to navigate the environment successfully, but it's particularly effective against insiders because attackers, we know that attackers are both greedy and lazy. And so if we present them with opportunities that appear to have the right kind of information, in many, many, many cases, they will in fact attempt to leverage that information and will detect that behavior very, very early in the process. So there's an example here, I think, which tells the story very well. One of the things I will say about insider threat is that when Illusive was founded, the people that founded Illusive Networks had an extensive history in cyber attack operations. And so our founders were nation state red team operators for their government. And when they came out of government work, they looked to build a security company and they said, what would we do to stop us, right? What was the number one tool that we used? How would we stop attackers operating at our level? And they built Illusive Networks. The assumption was that the majority of the detections that we would have at Illusive would be nation state operators or criminal enterprise. But what we found over the years is that, in fact, a slight majority, over 50%, of the detections that we get are the inside threat. The inside threat is very common and very, very difficult to detect. And so at one of our customers, a leading global bank, they had an issue of intellectual property theft. And this had been going on for some time, but when Illusive was deployed, we very quickly, I think it was the second week we were in that environment, got an alert that a user was reading and copying deceptive data that we had planted on a deceptive file share. So Illusive immediately gathered forensics information off of the source machine. What host computer were they coming from? What's the IP address and the running processes and the screen captures? What is the user looking at as they're doing this? And the security team was able to use that solid detection event. This is malicious behavior, no question. And able to correlate that user's behavior with all of their data in the email logs and the DLP system. And now knowing where to look, they identified that this user had been routinely stealing intellectual property and sending that information from the bank to a third-party email address. And so this is one of the things that's so powerful, is that without a capability like Illusive, many times these insiders go undetected for weeks or months, versus with Illusive, we're able to identify them very, very early in the process. We have many more examples, but I thought this one was just kind of interesting because of the financial reference. So here's really what Illusive is trying to do for our customers. This is our goal, what we're working towards. It's an aspiration. We're certainly not there yet, but as a company, we wake up every day and go to work on how are we going to really expand the capabilities for our customers into what we call a 0-0-0 world. And in this world, we believe that security for our customers would be dramatically changed if there were no privileged accounts available to attackers. One of the things that we see over and over and over again is that our customers have privileged account management, PAM solutions, identity and access management solutions, Active Directory group policy objects to control privileged users. So there's all of this policy that is being enforced throughout the environment, but there's very little auditing and examination to see what is left over in the environment, right? We're setting good policy, but we're not actually testing it as effectively as we should be. So when we deploy Illusive, one of our goals is to change this situation so that there are no privileged accounts accessible to attackers. And we know that from post-breach investigation, this is very, very common. Attackers are able to find and leverage privileged accounts in most organizations. Another big goal for us is that we would produce absolutely zero false positives that would be an issue for defenders. Now, honestly, we're not there yet. This is still an aspiration for us. We're working very hard to make this true. There still are some cases where a legitimate user will occasionally, in a rare instance, stumble across elusive deceptive data and then use it, and we'll throw an alert. Now, in fairness, that is a violation of policy because the user did violate security policy in order to find the deceptive information, and then they used it. So nonetheless, one of the things that we work on constantly is to build a platform that is not distracting defenders when they're out doing their work, because it's a difficult job as a security operator. And then the last thing is no time wasted in investigations that aren't necessary. We see over and over and over again that our customers spend a lot of time in the SOC or the incident responders triaging events, trying to understand, is this alert a serious alert? Is it not a serious alert? And so for us, changing this dynamic of no wasted time for defenders is a huge goal for us. So how does Illusive manage these goals? Well, the first thing that we do is we shrink the true attack surface. We continuously examine endpoints in the environment, looking for credentials or connection strings that an attacker could leverage to move laterally and get access to sensitive information in the environment and remove those objects. And I'll show you what that looks like here on the next couple of slides. But simply doing good cyber hygiene, cleaning up behind normal network and security operations that leave behind juicy opportunities for attackers. Shrinking the attack surface is an essential capability, and we're very excited about Attack Surface Manager and its capabilities in that space. The second thing we do is we create an illusion of an expanded attack surface, and this really changes the paradigm for the attacker, because normally everything that an attacker sees and experiences is real and reusable, something that they could leverage now or in the future. But with Illusive, it looks as if the environment is very different than it actually is, and this creates serious difficulties for the attacker, both in just how to orient themselves and understand the environment. Also, in an attempt to move, the early detection is key. And then the last thing is to speed response with actionable insights and intelligence with our forensics capability. And what's great about all of this is that all this capability from Illusive is done without a persistent agent. We are not installing a continuously running agent on the endpoints. We do run an executable on the endpoints in order to perform our work, but then that executable cleans itself up and goes away. There's no residual agent on the endpoint whatsoever. And this gives us a huge capability by having direct endpoint visibility, but no agent that makes us vulnerable and then also detectable. So winding down, I've got a few more slides to cover, and then we'll get into the Q&A portion. So we're eager, Karl and I, to engage your questions. Feel free to send those into the Q&A link in the Zoom management console, and we'll address your questions, as many of them as we can, at the end of the session. So this is a great visualization of what it looks like when Illusive is operating in the environment. So you can see here the little blue icons represent hosts in the environment. The little crowns represent connections to crown jewels or high value assets, sensitive applications in the environment. And then the little people represent credentials that are available on these systems. And you can see that most networks are a web of opportunities to use legitimate information to move between hosts. And what Illusive allows you to do is to see the environment as the attacker sees the environment. And so that attacker view is essential so that we understand how an attacker would move. So if we look at this in greater detail, Illusive Attack Surface Manager examines this information on each endpoint at least once a day, sometimes more often, and identifies privileged credentials and sensitive connection strings that do not provide any value to the organization, but they do represent significant risk. And we know that from Verizon data breach, 80% of attacks use stolen credentials. And interesting, over the last year or so, we've examined over 500,000 endpoints and found that almost 20% contain some form of a privileged credential at different points during the week. And this is a huge risk to the organization. Many organizations were in worse condition. So Illusive Attack Surface Manager not only identifies these conditions, but also cleans these conditions. We actually eliminate those objects where possible, simply remove them from the endpoint so that the attacker, particularly the insider, is not in a position to leverage these points of vulnerability in the environment. The second part of the process is really a lot of fun. And what we do here is we use the data that we've collected about the different hosts in the environment, the applications. We see databases and application servers and mainframe hosts, cloud access, data center interactions, all manner of Swift wire transfer hosts. And we see these interactions in the environment, and we use that data to automatically tell a story, as if there are more servers, more applications, more users, and more interactions throughout the environment. And we leave behind this residue on the production systems themselves, these breadcrumbs, these little data bits, saying to an attacker, here's a juicy opportunity to move laterally and get to something that's really important. Now, this capability is so effective that we have been tested against some of the top red team attackers in the world. From the good guys that we've worked with, everybody from the United States NSA, the security team at Microsoft and Cisco and Mandiant, we have defeated these red teams every single time. Over 100 tier 1 red team exercises on their own network. So the Microsoft test was done on the Microsoft network against the Microsoft red team, and we detected them in that environment. Same thing with the Cisco environment, where these red teams have a huge advantage, one would expect, in their own network. But because of the way Illusive creates this dynamic story of interesting data and deploys it throughout the environment, time and time again, attackers use the information that we planted and we detect them in the environment. So it just appears that there's a great opportunity to move in this environment, but in fact, the majority of this information is deceptive. When an attacker leverages this information and attempts to move against another entity, we immediately alert on that behavior and send a forensics binary to collect sensitive information from the environment in order to understand what's happening in the space as it is happening. And this is incredibly effective. We had one case with an insider where the insider moved against a deceptive file share in the environment. And we detected on them and gathered a bunch of information up to and including the screenshots of literally what's happening on the user's workstation as they're performing the attack. So the next day, this person's manager and a security analyst from the security team went into this man's office and said, hey, you interacted with this server yesterday, this Windows file share, map network drive. What was that about? And the guy said, I was in network neighborhood and I was double clicking real fast trying to get to one of the shares I usually get to, and landed on a different system. And when I got into the directory, I didn't recognize where I was, so I just disconnected and moved on. At which point, the security analyst turned around the Illusive console and showed to the user, in fact, what he actually did. And he said, no, you weren't in network neighborhood. You opened a command prompt and ran a net view command to see what hidden shares were available on the system. Then you ran a net use command to connect to a remote host. Then you used a file copy to copy a spreadsheet called executive compensation.xlsx onto your system. Here's a screen capture of you copying that spreadsheet into a PowerPoint presentation. Here's a screen capture of you taking that PowerPoint presentation and saving it as a PDF and then deleting the PowerPoint presentation And here's where you email that PDF to a non-company email address. So you are fired, and they escorted the gentleman off of the premises, and he was contacted by their attorneys and law enforcement. So this is an incredible capability. Many of our customers tell us that our real-time forensics have reduced their incident triage time in some cases up to 60, 70, 80, even 90% for one customer, just because typically by the time the SOC analyst can begin to look at an alert, Illusive has already gathered data on that host and has that available for the analyst. By the way, many of our customers actually use our forensics capability when they get an alert from a third-party tool. So they may get an alert from a proxy system or from an EDR platform, and in their SIM, they will instruct Illusive through the Illusive API to go out and automatically gather forensics information from the source system. And this is why the quick response that Illusive provides is so effective to the security team, because of the speed at which they're able to get information from both the source of the attack and then also the target of the attack. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for your time today. We're going to get into the Q&A session here with Miguel in just a moment, but for next steps, if you'd like to see a full demonstration of the Illusive platform, you can do that at illusivenetworks.com on the demo page. There are additional resources that are available on the resources page. Our blog is very interesting. There's some very creative people at Illusive writing about current events and trends in security, and so the blog. And then you can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. So thank you very much for your time. We sure appreciate the opportunity to work with Adaptive Security. And so Miguel, let me just turn it over to you for any questions that we've gotten in the session today.
Sure, Wade. Thank you very much for your presentation, also to Karl. Para aquellos que tengan preguntas respecto de lo que conversamos ahora en este webinar y nos presentaron, Wade, Karl, por favor, pueden hacer sus consultas en la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Está el botoncito disponible arriba en Q&A. No sé si es que o quisieran levantar la mano y hacer alguna consulta. Es tiempo de.
So, Miguel, did you have any of those questions you wanted to bring up today?
I'm waiting for a participant question. So anyway, I asked him for something about how the solution Illusive, right, complement other solution like EDR or any other couple of control that the company already have in the network. So I understand that this solution is focused on authenticate user, for example, but let us know how much we can get from Illusive.
Go ahead, Karl, you want to take that?
Sure. So the first thing that I would suggest is that solutions like for privileged access management, CyberArk, whether it's EDR and CrowdStrike, your SIM system, QRadar, Splunk, all of the primary security controls that you have in place today, I'd suggest are still necessary. Illusive does not displace those security technologies. But what it does do is it gives the organization a layer of protection that allows an error rate, which is extremely important. And going back to the sort of the initial concept that Wade introduced, which is the attackers only have to be right once. And so I would absolutely be deploying an EDR, or if you don't have one. However, the risk of having an EDR is it still has to be absolutely perfect, and one miss and we've sort of lost. Or the same goes with privilege access control. The same goes with the alerts in the SIM system. So what I would suggest that we look at Illusive as a plane that runs across the architecture that acts as a compensating control for all of the technologies deployed. And that's independent of, like, and I'll use my example specifically. We deployed Illusive at City National Bank at the point really where we were transitioning from a legacy McAfee to a Cylance sort of endpoint solution. And the important part about Illusive for me is it allowed me to undergo that transition from one endpoint solution to another, but having an extremely effective compensating control in place. And so over the course of several years, we updated many parts of our security architecture, and sort of along that entire pathway, I had the sort of the benefit of Illusive as a compensating control as I underwent transformation, moving from one technology to the next across the security stack.
Okay, Karl, thank you. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta que ustedes quisieran hacer? Los que están participando en este webinar hoy, lo pueden hacer ya sea por el chat o en la sección de preguntas y respuestas arriba en Q&A. Okay, so maybe there's no answer, no question. Bueno, les queremos agradecer entonces la participación el día de hoy de nuestro webinar junto a nuestro partner Illusive Networks. Espero que haya sido de interés la tecnología que revisamos hoy día. Vamos a estar haciéndoles llegar la presentación y eventualmente el video también de esta sesión para que ustedes lo puedan revisar a posterior o compartir con algunos colegas. En el caso de estar interesados, efectivamente podemos ayudarlos a entender mejor y explorar también cómo esto podría ser de ayuda en cada una de sus respectivas empresas. Nuevamente les agradezco el que hayan podido asistir hoy y los dejamos cordialmente invitados a nuevos webinars que estaremos desarrollando. Wade, Karl, thank you very much for your presentation today. The whole team, the Illusive Networks, thank you for your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. Our pleasure.
Have a good day.
Okay, bye.